Orthodoxy 101. So this is inspired by something that was said by Metropolitan Tikhon, or primate of the Church in North America, at the assembly I was at this week. He came down to our diocesan assembly, which was in Virginia, and he reminded us of some documentation or something put out by the Synod of Bishops, which means all the bishops for the Orthodox Church in America. That covers Canada, United States, and Mexico. And one of the things he mentioned in there, that in the documentation that was put out, was a reminder about the importance of confession and what the expected or ideal frequency would be if you're going to communion each week as a member of your parish. So in the last 200 years, of course, there was a movement to return back to. A lot of people had stopped going to communion on a regular basis. And so in many places, like in Russia and Ukraine, the emperor at some point made it, if you want to be an Orthodox Christian and a citizen, a Christian citizen of the nation, you had to go at least once a year. And so people would kind of once a year go to confession, and then they'd go to communion, and then they'd stop again for the rest of the year. And there was a big movement in the 19th century, kind of reaching its climax at St. John of Kronstadt, to start going back regularly, as was the custom throughout the early church, all the way up to the Byzantine period. And one of the things that's been debated is the frequency of communion, because originally this idea of going to confession and communion and tying them together was seen as problematic because they're not directly linked. But yet, confession is important. So the recommendation guideline that came out from the Synod this year is recommending, if you're going to communion each week, the ideal would be to try to confess around monthly, so about 12 times a year, or at the minimum, quarterly during the 4 fasting periods. So that would be the ideal. Somewhere between quarterly and monthly would be the ideal. And the other question always comes up is, well, what if I commit a sin? What do you mean by a sin? The sin, we don't have menial, or is it venial and mortal sins like in the Roman Catholic Church, but certainly the canons of the Church put sin on a level from lesser to more major. And if there is a penance normally ascribed to a sin, you should go and confess. Now, some of these are obvious, right? If you have, for example, violence, if you have physically struck someone or caused violence or harm to someone, the canon is excommunication. So if you've got it, but talking about someone, violence by language, not so much. It's not a penance unless you destroyed someone's reputation. But if you committed physical violence, you're technically excommunicated in the canon. It says you have to go to confession and accept the penance for that, right? Usually, if you have had evil, dirty thoughts in the mind, pornographic thoughts, you should confess those in your regular confession. But if you fall into sin in some way, you should come to confession and confess those actions before going to communion again. Okay, there are penances usually involved with those types of sins. And if you're ever not sure about whether a particular sin is more severe, something that kind of breaks your communion with God, and whether there's some period of penance that should be connected to it, come and ask me. Otherwise, try to come between quarterly and monthly, somewhere in the middle frequency to come. Coming once a year, which was kind of the minimum required by the Russian Empire, is not sufficient for most of us living in a world where we're constantly in contact with sin and need to sort of do an inventory of our internal life more often. So if you're not sure, come and talk to me again, because it is a little bit individualized in the sense that you should be talking to me as your spiritual father and saying, Father, how often do you think I should come? And me, hopefully knowing you, will say, this is what I recommend. So it's a recommendation. So that's our Orthodoxy 101.